This is a full story. Kitten wishes you all a happy and enjoyable story. I lost my memory. My brother told me I had been a simp for her for a whole year. I frowned and carefully examined the woman before me, puzzled. Turning to my friend, I asked, "Where's Hailey? Why isn't she here?" My friend's expression froze instantly. The woman in front of me turned pale. I heard her trembling voice ask, "Who is Hailey?" Her eyes glistened with tears, their intense emotion unfamiliar to me. I frowned but responded politely, "Hailey? She's my love." I lost my memory. When I opened my eyes, everything was white. The smell of disinfectant filled my nose. This scent wasn't unfamiliar. It had been with me since childhood. I sighed internally, fog forming in the ventilator. Hospital again? This broken body of mine. My face itched, and I tried to lift my hand to scratch it, only to find my hand tightly held. The palm was warm, the fingers smooth and delicate, interlocking with mine. I felt it carefully, my frown deepening. This wasn't Hailey's hand. Startled, I tried to withdraw my hand, but was gripped even tighter. Looking down, I saw the top of a head. It was a woman, her shiny black hair cascading down the sides of her face, faintly revealing delicate features behind the strands. She was asleep, her long, thick eyelashes trembling slightly. A straight nose and rosy lips completed her face. As I tried harder to free my hand, the woman stirred. Slowly, she opened her sleepy eyes. Dark circles marred her otherwise beautiful face. The moment she noticed my hand moving, she froze. Her gaze slowly met mine. What a beautiful face, I thought. After a brief silence, I studied her more closely. Tears glistened in her eyes. Her expression wavered for a moment before settling. She was strikingly beautiful, with fair, smooth skin, a long neck, and a slim waist. "Rocky, I'll call the doctor," she said in a panic, her voice tinged with sobs. I watched her leave, confused, scanning my mind for anyone like her. Nothing. Wait, who is this gorgeous woman? The doctor soon arrived with a team. A flurry of checks later, someone said, "Miss S., Mr. Rocky has passed the critical stage. Once the blood clot in his brain dissipates, he should regain his memory." The woman let out a sigh of relief, her pale face regaining a hint of color. Turning to look at me, her eyes held the light of someone narrowly escaping disaster. Her radiant face seemed to glow. I blinked and curled my lips slightly in acknowledgement. After the doctors left, the room grew silent. The woman walked slowly but with determination. She sat by my bedside, forcing a slightly awkward smile. It was clear she rarely smiled, making her expression seem strange. Her slender shoulders slouched slightly as she cautiously held my hand, as if handling fragile porcelain. In a low voice, she murmured, "Rocky, thank goodness." I didn't know what she meant, but she didn't elaborate. The sensation of her touch made me uneasy. I didn't know her, but she obviously knew me, and it seemed we were close. The ventilator was removed. I moved my lips slightly, my voice soft, barely a whisper. Noticing this, the woman immediately stood and leaned closer. She smelled strongly of disinfectant, a sign she'd been in the hospital for a long time. "Rocky, what's wrong?" she asked gently, her eyes filled with patience as they focused on mine. "Hailey, where is she?" I struggled to ask, my throat dry and tight. Her hand froze. Her beautiful face turned slightly to fully face me. "What?" Her bright eyes showed a flicker of confusion. "Where is Hailey?" After adjusting my breathing, I asked again, clear and deliberate, my gaze unwavering, almost obsessive. The woman was utterly stunned. "Hailey was my neighbor, 3 years older than me. When I was 6, we became neighbors. She lived alone, her parents divorced, neither wanting her. She was beautiful, with gentle features and a soft smile that always lingered. I loved clinging to her, calling out sister, sister, endlessly. She always responded patiently. When I was 14, my parents died in a car accident on a rainy night. Within days, relatives divided up their assets. I became a burden, passed around like an unwanted package. I hadn't seen Hailey in a long time. For a year, I lived a life of dependence on others until I entered high school and needed tuition. That's when my uncle finally showed his true colors. It was Hailey who took me in. She was 18 that year. She gently stroked my head and said, "Rocky, sister will make sure you go to school." Back then, I didn't know she planned to sell her house, just to scrape together my tuition. She worked multiple part-time jobs after school, but never told me. The one-bedroom rental was bright and cozy, with a small bedroom. Because of my poor health, she gave it to me. Sunlight would stream onto my soft bed during the day. Hailey slept on the couch in the living room. When she slept, her beautiful brows would furrow slightly, as if her dreams were filled with unspoken troubles. In winter, the rental was freezing. Only my room had a heater. When I returned on weekends, it was always warm. But Hailey slept in the cold living room. I suggested we sleep together, but she refused. That led to our biggest argument, or rather, my one-sided tantrum. "Sis, it's okay. Really, it's okay," I said, my heart aching. Hailey smiled softly, brushing away my tears with her gentle hand, then firmly shook her head. In the end, I stubbornly camped on the couch until she relented. She slept on the floor next to my bed, her limit. The heater's warmth spread through the room. Wrapped in thick blankets, I even broke into a sweat. Hailey lay on the cold floor, careful not to disturb me when turning over. Under the pale moonlight, I watched her delicate face as she slept, from her lightly furrowed brows to her ivory nose, and then her rosy lips. Back in high school, Hailey was famous for her beauty. Her refined features, long neck, and ever-present gentle smile won her admiration. Being her brother brought me some perks. But at that moment, watching her closed eyes, my feelings changed. It wasn't just familial love, nor was it mere infatuation. It felt like a mix of yearning, dependence, and unease. Late at night, I sat up quietly. When my feet touched the cold floor, I shivered. So this is what it feels like. Hailey woke up, meeting my gaze in the stillness. Breaking the silence, I patted the soft bed, half-threateningly saying, "Wherever you sleep, I'll sleep." Seeing my stubbornness, she sighed softly. She climbed into the bed, careful to lie on the edge, one turn away from falling off. Feeling her warmth beside me, I closed my eyes. The next day, Hailey bought a thick quilt and laid it beside my bed. That's how we spent 3 winters. She was still my sister, but I knew that a certain love had already taken root in my heart, growing like wild vines, binding Hailey tightly. Without a path forward, love turned to madness. She was my path. The woman said that I liked her, that I had pursued her for a long time. I didn't believe it at all. Impossible, I weakly but firmly denied. I could never like anyone else. I looked up at her, my eyes flashing with anger. Her face instantly turned as pale as paper. Her lips moved slightly, but in the end, she didn't say a word. There was noise at the door. I looked over, filled with anticipation. A man in a suit stepped into view. My gaze fell in disappointment. Why hasn't Hailey come to see me yet? The man saw me, and his eyes reddened. He quickened his pace, gripping my hand as though I had just survived a disaster. "Rocky, you're finally awake?" he said, his voice trembling with emotion. I stared at him, confused. After a moment, I hesitantly asked, "Sorry, but do I know you?" A trace of sadness flickered in his eyes, but he quickly smiled. "I'm Jack, your best friend." After a pause, he gestured to the woman. "And she's Serena, your?" He hesitated for a long while before finishing. "She's your friend." Relief washed over me, but I couldn't help feeling a bit angry at Serena for making such a joke. "Do you know where Hailey is?" I asked softly. "Why hasn't she come to see me yet?" Jack's smile froze momentarily. He was silent for a while, gripping my hand tighter without realizing it. A flurry of dreadful thoughts raced through my mind, my heart pounding faster. My face turned pale. Jack's expression became visibly anxious. Serena's too. She quickly walked to my side, reaching out to grab my hand. I pulled back sharply, clutching Jack's hand instead. "Has something happened to Hailey? Please tell me," I begged. The hand that had hung midair slightly curled before slowly withdrawing in disappointment. Though I was the patient, Serena's face was paler than mine. "Rocky, no, Hailey's fine," Jack reassured me quickly. He leaned closer, speaking in an unusually firm tone. "She's just working abroad right now. She'll be back in 6 months." After hesitating, he added, "I just got distracted because you had always told me not to let your sister know if you were hospitalized again. If you really miss her, I can lend you my phone to call her." I released Jack's hand, and after a long silence, I rasped, "Where's my phone?" "It was broken," he replied immediately. I stared at the hand he was hiding behind his back, trembling slightly. Forcing a smile, I said, "How long was I asleep?" Jack unconsciously tightened his grip as though trying to draw strength from his hands. "You've been asleep for a week," he said, his lips pressed into a tight smile. I stopped looking at his expression and turned to the window. The warm sunlight crept over the sill, illuminating the swirling dust in the air. It reminded me of the morning when my college entrance exam scores came out. I had fallen asleep, too exhausted to stay awake. When I woke, I saw her slender figure hunched over the laptop. It was a gift she had bought for me when I started school. The room was shrouded in darkness, the blue light of the screen outlining her pale profile. She was so focused, repeatedly refreshing the website. She was so serious that she didn't even notice I had woken up. The clock read 6, and the moonlight outside was was cold. She had stayed up all night. A week. It's been so long. Rocky. Jack's voice was nervous, his forehead glistening with sweat. I smiled at him and said, "Then I'll contact her after I'm discharged." After a pause, I added, almost whispering, "Just tell her I've been busy lately, and I'll visit her when I'm free." Jack visibly relaxed, letting out a breath. "Sure, you can call her once you're feeling better." When Jack left, the room was silent save for Serena. She didn't say a word, only looked at me as if trying to peer into my heart. "Do you still have something to say?" I asked hesitantly. "I'd like to sleep now." Serena lowered her eyes at my words. The room fell silent. I lay flat on the bed, staring at the stark white ceiling. Since childhood, I'd always been in poor health, my heart condition preventing me from strenuous activity. But ever since Hailey appeared, she never left my bedside. I never asked my parents to stay with me. They were always too busy. I thought I didn't need anyone. Until Hailey. That's when I realized I did. Lying alone in a hospital bed wasn't the same as being cared for. The former left you lonely, the latter reassured. "Who is Hailey?" Serena's voice broke my reverie. She had approached without my noticing, her straight shoulders slightly slumped, her gaze dark. I looked up at her and curved my lips into a faint smile. "She's the person I love most," I said earnestly, my tone filled with longing. "She's the best person in the world." A flicker of something broke in Serena's eyes. She opened her mouth slightly, as if to say something, but all she managed was, "What about me?" I didn't catch her words and looked at her in confusion. "What?" I asked. She didn't repeat herself. Instead, a glimmer of tears flashed in her eyes before vanishing. I thought I might have imagined it. When I looked again, her clear eyes betrayed no emotion. She stood there for a long time, until drowsiness overtook me. As I drifted off, I faintly felt her gaze lingering on my face, but her hand, hovering in midair, never touched me. Someone gently adjusted my blanket. Moments later, I heard deliberately softened footsteps recede. The door closed. By evening, the sky outside was painted with fiery reds and golds. Jack pushed open the door. "Rocky, your phone is fixed," he said cheerfully. I focused on the old phone in his hand and took it cautiously. It was a gift Hailey had bought for me 5 years ago when I got into the University of Toronto. "Rocky, you can call your sister. The doctor said you can be discharged soon," Jack said lightly, but his nervous fingers betrayed him. I ran my fingers over the wallpaper, tracing the outline of her shadow. I forced a smile. "Can I?" I asked. "Of course," Jack said. I opened the contacts page, my finger hovering over the Hailey option. The air grew thick with tension. I pressed down. The call connected almost instantly, as if Hailey had been waiting. I held the phone to my ear, my breaths shallow. There was only the sound of breathing on the other end. Both sides were silently weighing their words. "Hello? Is this Hailey?" I asked softly, my lips trembling. The silence stretched unbearably. Just when I was about to panic, she spoke, her voice hoarse. "Yes, Rocky, it's me." It was Hailey's voice, that familiar, patient, and gentle voice. Tears surged uncontrollably from my eyes. I wiped at them desperately, but they wouldn't stop. "Hailey, I've missed you so much," I choked out. The sister who had endured so much for me. The sister who was endlessly gentle and patient. Now, she was so far away. "Rocky, be good and wait for me to come back, all right?" Her voice trembled slightly, coaxing me softly. I nodded repeatedly, tears streaming down my face. Jack gently patted my shoulder, trying to console me. The scorching tears soaked the sheets as I cried myself red-eyed. "It's all right, Rocky. It's all right," Jack kept murmuring. I nodded vigorously, feeling a heavy weight lifted from my heart. I had thought Hailey was gone. Jack hadn't lied after all. After my discharge, Jack took me to a villa I had never been to before. In the yard, white, purple, and pink lisianthus bloomed fervently. I knew their meaning, unending remembrance. "Our one, this is your home," Jack said with a smile. After a pause, he added, "Your sister bought this house." I looked at the lisianthus swaying in the wind and smiled faintly. A black Bentley was parked outside the door. It had been following us since we left the hospital. I knew it was Serena. There were so many things in my mind I couldn't understand. Serena was one of them. As Jack wheeled me into the villa, my chest suddenly tightened and I instinctively frowned. Fragments of scattered memories flashed in my mind. I seemed to see a man, forcing a smile while approaching a woman nervously. The woman's face was blurry, but her voice was cold. "Rocky, do you have no self-respect?" The man's pale cheeks instantly welled up with tears. He hurriedly wiped them away, stammering nervously, "I'm sorry, He never finished his sentence. Instead, he lowered his head silently, looking desolate. It was me. I was shocked to see myself like that, reduced to such abject humility. The woman glanced at him condescendingly, her eyes filled with disdain. She bypassed him and walked toward the door. With a loud bang, I instinctively flinched. She had slammed the door shut and left. I saw myself pale, lips trembling. What I was murmuring was sister. I gripped the armrest of the wheelchair tightly, my heart uneasy. Why would I call someone who wasn't Hailey's sister? I didn't understand. Serena came in the afternoon. I watched her walk in familiarly, her red lips pursed. Seeing me, her pale face showed a cautious smile. "Rocky, are you feeling better?" she asked carefully. I curved my lips faintly and nodded politely. "Yes, much better. Thank you." Her face turned even paler. Her lips moved, as if she wanted to say something, but finally stopped at the corners of her mouth. "That's good," she murmured, her gaze trembling as it lowered. We sat in silence, me seated, her standing. She dared not look at me again. I think I remembered Serena, though only faintly. It must have been our first meeting. In a bar, she was drunk to the point of collapse. I stood a short distance away, trembling as I watched her. I heard myself say, "Please, don't do this. I beg you, don't do this." At that time, my face was paler than Serena's now, as if I had been struck a devastating blow by fate. And what did Serena say? Let me think. I remember now. That stunningly beautiful face was filled with disgust. She waved away my hand, trying to stop her from drinking, and sneered, "Who's this pathetic man? Get lost." I staggered back a few steps, despair filling my gaze. Back then, Hailey wasn't with me. I snapped out of my reverie, looking at Serena in confusion. She was nothing like the overbearing woman in my memory, and yet that face unmistakably declared it was her. How could someone like her possibly be a friend? My heart full of doubt, I voiced it aloud. "Serena, are we really?" I hesitated, choosing my words carefully. "Are we really friends?" Hearing this, Serena's body trembled, as if paralyzed. She remained still, head lowered, like a clay figure. For a moment, I had the illusion that if given a chance, Serena would retreat into the shadows to hide herself away. This once beautiful, confident woman now seemed like a child caught misbehaving, panic-stricken. She opened her mouth, but closed it again. Her eyes flickered with struggle. It wasn't until a soft breeze carrying the scent of lisianthus flowers blew past that she snapped out of it. The fragrance was like a distant thought, or a warm embrace from afar. I turned toward the window, looking at the vibrant blossoms. For some reason, I felt a pang of sadness. Serena followed my gaze to the window. After a moment of silence, a faint smile appeared on her lips, as if recalling a cherished memory. "They're yours," she said, her voice hoarse with nostalgia. "You spent 2 days planting them." She looked at me, hesitant yet hopeful. "Do you know what they symbolize?" Of course I knew, but before I could answer, she answered herself. Perhaps she assumed I had lost my memory and forgotten everything. With a trace of expectation, she said, "Lisianthus means a heartfelt confession." I looked at her in surprise, finally understanding the unspoken emotion in her eyes. Serena loved me? How strange. My heart was genuinely surprised. I shook my head and corrected her. "No, it means unending remembrance." The light in Serena's eyes shattered. The faint smile at her lips vanished. I didn't look at Serena again. I wheeled myself toward the study. She followed silently, the corner of a worn phone peeking out of her pocket. I glanced at it, puzzled, and turned back. She didn't seem like someone sentimental enough to keep old things. Serena's presence caught me off guard. She was like those fragmented memories, always intruding unexpectedly, and each memory was far from pleasant. Before the lisianthus, the yard was full of roses. Roses Serena had ripped out in a fit of rage. I remember her storming at me that day, her face terrifyingly dark. Her pale, elegant hands were marred by the thorns, covered in blood. And what was I doing then? I think I was exhausted, sitting silently with my head down. "Serena, don't be angry," I heard myself say wearily. "Are roses beautiful?" Serena asked coldly. That version of me looked up at her, eyes clean and devoid of any emotion. "Why are you angry?" I asked, confused. Serena stared at me, her fury growing with my indifference. The less I reacted, the closer she seemed to the edge of collapse. "Rocky, you really?" She suddenly softened her tone, walking closer to me. Her face turned gentle and affectionate, her bloodied hands cupping my cheeks. I saw her drawing nearer, her face stopping an inch from my nose. Breaths mingled, close enough to feel. Serena's eyes brimmed with madness. I always felt that even if she descended into hell, she wouldn't let me go. "Rocky, you must never fall for anyone else," she whispered sweetly in my ear, her voice voice chilling to the bone. That bed of roses lay devastated, stripped bare. Especially Sarah, she added, her teeth clenched in warning, but moments later, her expression softened again. She spoke gently. Shall we plant flowers you like? I looked up, studying her expression, wondering if she was losing her mind again. Her gaze lowered, dark and unreadable. I smiled faintly. Let's plant lisianthus, I said. Later that evening, an unexpected guest arrived at the villa. I wasn't particularly bothered, but Serena's expression turned grim. Jack stood beside me, his gaze wary. It was a woman. Her face bore a resemblance to Serena's. Sure enough, the next moment, I heard Serena coldly ask, Sarah, what are you doing here? So, they were sisters. Sarah glanced at me with a mocking smile and chuckled. Of course, I came to see Rocky. Or, should I have come to see you? Sarah looked around the villa and clicked her tongue. Rocky never lived here before. So what is this? One hospital visit and now you're inseparable? She turned her gaze to me, curiosity flickering in her eyes. Rocky, don't you mind that she left you alone in the mountains for Tony? Sarah didn't come with good intentions, but it seemed she had a bit of sympathy for me. I looked up at Serena's expression. Her hands were clenched and her eyes were filled with fear. What was she afraid of? That I'd learn the truth? Or that I'd leave? As these thoughts surfaced, I quickly pushed them aside. I was surprised at my own arrogance, thinking that someone as cold as Serena would fear losing me. I have amnesia, I said calmly. So, I don't understand a word of what you're saying. Sarah raised an eyebrow, amusement flashing in her eyes. She looked at me, then at Serena, standing there alone, and burst into laughter. Serena, you're pathetic, she sneered sharply. Rocky doesn't care about you at all anymore. She enunciated each word with crystal clarity. Serena didn't respond. Her face turned pale and ashen. Moments later, her once straight shoulders sagged and her eyes dimmed. Her hoarse voice echoed in the empty living room. Do you have anything else to say? Sarah snorted and then smiled brightly. I came to deliver an invitation, she added. Tony and I are finally getting married, destined to be together. She looked down at Serena, her tone teasing. You know, back then, at least Rocky would stand in front of you and argue with me. But now, she spread her hands, grinning. My dear sister, you've lost everything. Her mood seemed cheerful, and her smile carried a sharp provocation. Serena hung her head, refusing to respond. Finding it dull, Sarah shrugged, preparing to leave. It seemed her sole purpose in coming was to ridicule Serena. Just as she was about to step out, her eyes landed on the lisianthus flowers in the yard, and her smile deepened. Rocky, she called out softly, her tone dripping with sweetness. I looked up at her. She smiled at me, her eyes curving. The roses I sent you last time, did you like them? Serena collapsed, covering her face with her hands. Soon, tears fell to the floor with an audible plop. Sarah, satisfied with her triumph, left humming a tune. The roar of a sports car engine echoed in the quiet evening, fading into the distance. The pieces in my mind clicked into place. Ah, so that's why. Serena started coming to the villa almost daily, sometimes in the morning, sometimes in the evening. Occasionally, her shoulders were damp with morning dew. She never rang the doorbell, always arriving quietly. I once asked Jack why she did this. Jack chuckled lightly, his tone laced with sarcasm. Perhaps she's trying to imitate someone. He wore a faint, unreadable expression. Yet, for some reason, I could sense his disdain for Serena, and possibly for me. My past felt like an ever-expanding fog. Within it, I could only see the years I spent with Hailey. As for Serena, she left no trace at all. Jack leaned down, his gaze shadowed as he looked into my eyes. Rocky, he said, I hope you never remember. It'd be easier that way, but I also hope you do. Don't forget. Forget who? Or forget what? Jack wouldn't tell me. I knew that. He stared quietly out the window, his expression sorrowful, as if he wanted to bear my sadness alongside his own. I pressed my hand against my chest. It ached, a dull, heavy pain. Jack. I called his name softly. He snapped out of his thoughts, a smile quickly curving his lips. How did we meet? I asked curiously. Since I woke up, he'd claimed to be my best friend, yet he never mentioned our past. Jack's face visibly stiffened. His trembling hand moved quickly to the wheelchair handle, gripping it so tightly his knuckles turned white. We met in college. Hit it off right away. He avoided my gaze and spoke directly. I stared quietly at his tightly pressed lips and sighed, lowering my head. That lie was far too clumsy. A soft breeze stirred the white curtains by the floor-to-ceiling window, revealing the lisianthus flowers in the yard. And Serena's car. When did she arrive? Jack noticed too. He frowned slightly and went to open the door. Moments later, Serena walked in behind him. Good morning, Serena. I greeted her politely. The formality of my tone was deliberate. Serena lifted the corners of her lips into an awkward smile. Good morning, Rocky, she replied. Strangely, since I woke up, the three of us hadn't shared a single genuine smile. "Have you had breakfast?" I asked. The question came out almost instinctively, surprising even myself. Serena's fingers, resting at her sides, curled slightly. She opened her mouth, as if remembering something, and her eyes reddened. "I did," she said, her voice hoarse and carrying a hint of a sob. Out of courtesy, I avoided looking at her. Yet deep down, I had a feeling that I'd asked her this question countless times before, but her answer then must have been entirely different. After recovering fully, I no longer needed a wheelchair. It happened to be close to my sister's birthday, so I decided to visit the mall to buy yarn and knit her a sweater. "It's still summer. Winter is far away," Jack said with an amused look, trying to dissuade me. I smiled awkwardly, feeling a bit self-conscious. "Yarn is cheaper in the summer," I replied with a laugh. In high school, money was tight. Winter clothing was always expensive. Hailey would always insist on buying me the best scarves, sweaters, coats, hats, and gloves, but she was reluctant to buy anything for herself. Feeling for her, I started buying yarn and learning to knit from online tutorials. The first sweater I made was downright embarrassing, but Hailey wore it happily anyway. After that, every winter garment she owned was hand-knit by me. We spent 3 winters like that, but after I went to college, how did Hailey get through the winters? The thought made me feel a twinge of sadness, my mind drawing a blank. The person who had meant the most to me was no longer a part of my memories. Jack took me to the nearest mall. It was luxurious, brightly lit, and filled with dazzling goods. Every item was more expensive than I had anticipated, far exceeding my expectations. I had money, though. Yes, that was another thing I couldn't understand after waking up. Logically, having just graduated a year ago, I should have been broke, but I had a bank card with a balance of $5 million. Not a cent of it had been touched. It was perfectly intact. Holding that card didn't bring me any joy, only revulsion, a deep-seated aversion, as if I wished it would disappear. "Let's go to the second floor," Jack suggested gently. I nodded and followed him to the elevator. As we waited, someone called out to me, "Rocky." The hesitant voice came from behind me. I turned to look. 2 men stood there. Their previously uncertain expressions shifted to recognition when they saw my face. "It really is you," said the man in a black suit, looking down at me from above. Beside him stood another man, tall and handsome, casually dressed with a lazy posture. The suited man, despite his imposing manner, resembled a clown next to his companion. "Hello, and you are?" I ventured cautiously. Jack looked equally puzzled, so it seemed he didn't know them either. "Rumor has it you've lost your mind?" The man in the suit sneered, clearly reveling in my predicament. The more refined man frowned slightly, signaling to his companion to stop, then turned to me with a gentle expression. "I'm Tony, and this is Peter," he said. "We're friends of Serena." His gaze bore into mine, as if trying to gauge my emotions. "Oh," I muttered slowly, furrowing my brow. My lack of enthusiasm seemed to provoke Peter. "What's with that attitude?" he snapped, clearly irritated. "Playing dumb doesn't erase the past. Do you think forgetting everything makes things right?" I was curious. "What are you talking about?" Peter faltered, then huffed before blurting out, "The disgusting things you did as Serena's lapdog." I frowned, his roundabout accusations grating on my patience. "What exactly are you accusing me of?" Peter's eyes widened in indignation. "You pushed Tony off a mountain out of jealousy." I found the claim absurd. "You're lying," I said firmly. "You're denying it?" Peter barked, his hands on his hips like a soldier ready to charge. Shaking my head, I repeated, "I wouldn't do something like that." Tony chuckled softly, his demeanor calm and unaffected. "Peter, let it go," he said, stuffing his hands in his pockets and turning to leave. What kind of behavior was this? It made it seem like I really had done it. "Wait, explain what happened," I demanded, my irritation bubbling over. Peter gave Tony a reassuring pat on the shoulder before turning back to me, his anger unyielding. "Didn't you make Serena throw you a birthday party on Mountling? Tony found out and organized everyone to join you, but while he was chatting with you, you got jealous of how Serena treated him. You shoved him off the mountain. If not for some trees breaking his fall, you'd be rotting in jail right now." Their conviction left me shaken. Could I really be that awful? Still, something didn't add up. "If that's true, why didn't you send me to prison?" I asked skeptically. Both Peter and Tony froze for a moment before Peter awkwardly replied, "You ended up in the hospital, and we didn't want to bother with you." "Wait, my birthday was over a month ago." "So?" I pondered aloud. "I went to the hospital on my birthday?" My voice turned cold as I glanced at Jack. He looked unusually pale, his straight back slightly hunched. Jack shook his head and murmured, "Rocky, don't listen to them." But Peter's voice cut through like a knife. "You were admitted the day after your birthday. We didn't know you'd had a heart transplant and assumed you could make it down the mountain on your own." A roaring sound filled my ears. My legs weakened and my vision blurred with confusion. "A heart transplant?" I whispered. Jack's hands trembled as he steadied me. He lowered his head, avoiding my eyes. "Whose heart is it?" I demanded, clutching his arm tightly. "Jack, it's not hers, right? It can't be hers. Hailey was healthy. Live organ donation is illegal. Tell me it's not hers." Tears streamed down my face as I begged for an answer. Jack's lips pressed into a thin line, his voice barely audible. "It's not hers, Rocky. Your heart isn't hers." Relief began to wash over me until Jack added, his voice trembling with anguish, "But Hailey is dead." Thunder roared in my mind, a crushing blow to my very core. My knees buckled and everything went black. The day I filled out my college application, my heart condition flared up. I was rushed to the hospital in critical condition, told I needed a transplant. We lacked both money and a healthy donor heart. Hailey humbly sought help from old classmates, but only one agreed, Jack. They met at a cafe, where Jack gave everything he could. As they left, crossing a zebra crossing, a speeding Mercedes ran a red light. The crosswalk was crowded. Jack, Hailey, and Serena's sister, Sarah, were all there. Hailey sacrificed herself to save Jack, pushing him out of harm's way. She and Sarah were left lying in pools of blood. Jack crawled to Hailey's side. Even in her final moments, she searched desperately for her phone to call me one last time. She told me her parents were sending her abroad urgently, and there wasn't time to say goodbye. She said they'd agreed to pay for my surgery and had arranged for someone to take care of me. She promised she'd return in 6 months. Hailey died, but not before ensuring her compensation money would save my life. Yet when her heart reached the hospital, it wasn't for me. The S family's daughter, Serena, also needed an emergency transplant. Their influence bypassed countless waiting families, and the heart went to her instead. I was left clinging to life, barely surviving long enough to receive a heart from another donor. Jack was the one who came to care for me. As I recovered, the S family approached me. Knowing their actions were unjust, they offered me money, $5 million, as hush money. They feared I'd seek revenge. The name of the recipient? Serena. And so began the cruel twist of fate. I mistook her for someone else. After being discharged from the hospital, I devoted myself to studying at university. Because this was Hailey's wish, I feared she might be watching over me from above. I made an effort to live well and keep thoughts of death at bay. But in the year I graduated, after taking our class graduation photo, everyone decided to gather at a bar for a final celebration. Since I couldn't drink, I planned to order a glass of water. At the bar counter, I saw Serena, the woman from that photo, alive and standing before me. Inside her chest beat Hailey's heart. I watched as she downed one shot of strong liquor after another. My vision blurred. She had taken Hailey's heart but didn't cherish it. How could she? Unable to hold back, I walked over and grabbed her hand. "You can't," I said firmly. She didn't recognize me. Perhaps she didn't even know I existed. "Get lost, you creep," she said disdainfully. I stepped back, utterly humiliated, my gaze fixated on her chest as if I could see inside, to glimpse Hailey's heart. From that moment, I started following Serena. She found me unbearably annoying at first, but over time, for reasons I couldn't fathom, she began to tolerate my presence. I wanted her to take care of herself. At the very least, not drink, not skip breakfast, not stay up late, just as Hailey once cared for me. Everyone around her knew there was a man, always meddling, always watching out for Serena, her devoted lapdog. Serena went from being impatient and dismissive to indifferent, and eventually, she sometimes listened to me, but only as long as I didn't touch her sore spots. Sarah and Tony. Sarah hated her the most. Tony was the one she liked. Sarah's mother had been driven to death by Serena's mother. Serena's very existence was proof of their father's betrayal. Her birth carried the original sin. Serena couldn't fight back. She could only endure Sarah's hatred. Tony, her childhood companion, was the one who found her every time she hid away in darkness. He was always there for her. She once hoped to marry him, but Serena wasn't the heir of the S family. Tony got engaged to Sarah instead. Tony told her, "Serena, we're not right for each other." What he wanted, Serena couldn't give. This was the story Serena calmly recounted to me later when she suddenly proposed to me. On the very mountain I had planned to climb alone, she looked down and spoke with apprehension. "Rocky, I used to have a bad temper, but I won't anymore. I've told you everything, and I don't like Tony anymore." I stared blankly at her chest, lost in thought. If we married, would I? I bit my lip tightly, yet I couldn't bring myself to say yes. The person I wanted to marry wasn't her. Holding a bouquet, her hands trembled slightly as she continued softly, "I don't want the S family's wealth. I can give you a good life on my own. Rocky, will you marry me?" The wind on the mountain was chilly, stinging my cheeks. Instinctively, I turned to shield Serena from the breeze. She smiled faintly, her face filled with happiness. I was a liar. That much I knew. But they were thieves. They stole first. I repeated this to myself, hoping to ease my my guilt. The word yes was on the verge of leaving my lips when Serena's next words froze me in place. The cold wind pierced my chest, leaving a trail of ice, freezing my heart solid. Rocky, Sarah has a weak heart. Don't fight with her anymore. What had I been working toward all my life? Looking at Serena's radiant face, I felt nothing but bitterness at fate's cruelty. Where is Sarah? That was my reply. When I found Sarah, she was sitting on the railing of the mountain, gazing at the distant peaks, her feet dangling over the void. When she saw me, her cold expression softened into a smile. Well, look who's finally moved up the ladder, she sneered. I ignored her taunts and rushed to her, grabbing her sleeve in desperation. Did you have a heart transplant? I asked. Sarah paused, then broke into a laugh. Yeah, she said casually. Why? Regret not pissing me off to death? I let go of her, sinking to the ground in despair. My gaze was hollow. Serena and Tony soon arrived. Seeing Sarah and me together, their smiles faltered. Tony stepped forward, gripping my shoulder. Rocky, why are you here with Sarah? Serena hurried to my side, trying to help me up. I pulled away from her, meeting her startled gaze. Serena, I don't like you, I said. She wavered, nearly losing her balance. Well, Rocky, finally seen the light? Sarah mocked with a smirk. Tony grabbed my shoulder tightly, his voice cold and firm. Mr. Rocky, this isn't funny. I tried to pull my arm free, but Tony held on tighter. Anger surged, and I shoved back. In the next instant, Tony's eyes widened in disbelief as he stumbled backward, falling down the stone steps. Sarah and Serena both panicked and ran after him. Peter, who had just arrived, assumed I had pushed Tony, but he had fallen on his own. That day, everyone hurried down the mountain. I alone remained, having lost all will to live. It was all wrong. Everything was wrong. I had come to pray for my parents and Hailey. In the end, it became my burial ground. Would Hailey come to fetch me? That was my only thought as I closed my eyes. When I opened my eyes, the familiar sight greeted me. I was back in the hospital, the same setting and the same person. Seeing me awake, Serena's eyes lit up with joy. She quickly grabbed my hand. Rocky, her hoarse voice called out. I smiled faintly and gently withdrew my hand. Serena froze, then forced a smile, trying to please me. Do you feel unwell anywhere? I'll call the doctor. I shook my head, my lips moving slightly. What? She leaned closer to ask. Her beautiful face was right in front of me, and tears welled up in my eyes. Between Serena and me, who owed whom? Even I couldn't tell. The quarrels, grievances, and sarcasm seemed like they had just happened yesterday. But this was the path I chose myself. I couldn't blame her. Where's Sarah? I asked softly. Serena's hand trembled slightly, her eyes flickering with shattered light. Rocky, don't treat me like this, she pleaded. I gave her an apologetic smile, my gaze persistent as I looked at her. Where's Sarah? I repeated. A single tear fell onto my eyelid with a splat. Serena looked so desperate, so fragile. The only good memory between us was probably that day. The garden was full of eustoma flowers swaying in the wind. She stood quietly by the window, her eyes gradually filling with joy. That blissful, contented smile was the first I had ever seen on her cold, elegant face. Unfortunately, one wrong step led to another. What do you want with her, Rocky? Serena asked, her voice trembling. Her eyes were red as she spoke humbly. She's getting married, Rocky. I knew that. I wouldn't make the same mistake twice. Serena, can you ask her to come? I lowered my gaze and spoke softly. I want to hear it again. Hailey's heartbeat. A gentle hand stroked my head. All right, that was her answer. Serena had finally learned how to care for someone, but that was no longer about me. The day Sarah came, she uncharacteristically refrained from sharp remarks or sarcasm. She quietly walked in, sat on the chair beside me, and looked up at me. Rocky, are you going to die? She asked abruptly. I smiled, my face flushing slightly. Not yet, I replied. She frowned. I quickly added, I won't commit suicide, but my health isn't great. Living to a ripe old age isn't likely. Her mother had committed suicide. Sarah was deeply afraid of such things. Everyone carries fragile pasts. For Sarah and Serena, those pasts became the blades that had killed them repeatedly. They couldn't escape or avoid them, only endure the endless cycle. Sarah's frown eased. She leaned back in her chair, her posture relaxed and casual. So, all this time, I was the one you were meant to worship, she teased. I coughed a few times, feeling awkward for the first time. Maybe. Sarah went quiet for a while. Good thing it wasn't me, she murmured. Sarah, the elders of the S family won't accept you being with Serena. Staying by her side will only hurt you, she said seriously. It was rare to see her this earnest. I nodded. I know. Sarah raised her brows. Are you leaving Serena? I gave a quiet She smiled slightly, her mood seeming lighter, but soon she sobered. Lowering her gaze, she stared off into space, her long, dark lashes trembling gently. gently. "Rocky, you're a good person," she said slowly, each word deliberate. "Serena doesn't love anyone, not even herself." Looking back at me, she spoke softly. "She only loves those who care for her. Even if you elope and get married, one day she'll grow bored and revert to the person filled with resentment. You deserve someone better." When had Sarah started seeing me as a friend? I thought carefully but came up empty. "Aren't you that someone better?" I joked. Sarah chuckled softly but shook her head. "I'm not." She looked a bit defeated, yet seemed content to revel in her self-destruction. For the S&T families, Tony choosing Sarah was merely a profitable transaction. Before Sarah left, she gave me a hug. She didn't say anything. Yet, somehow, I felt my heartbeat quicken. "Does it sound familiar?" she asked. My eyes reddened as I nodded. I had once, late at night, hugged my sister secretly as she slept, listening to her heartbeat, the heartbeat of someone I loved. It had been fast, like rolling thunder. At the time, I thought all heartbeats sounded like that, but now I knew it wasn't one-sided. "Goodbye, Rocky," Sarah said softly, curving her lips in farewell. She waved and walked out the door without looking back. My tears blurred my vision, and for a moment, I mistook her retreating figure for another, a gentle and slender shadow from the past. "Goodbye, Rocky." It was my sister speaking. The wind outside drifted into the hospital room, wrapping me in its final embrace. "Goodbye, sis." My love story had finally reached its conclusion. From then on, I would walk alone, licking old wounds in solitude while living earnestly in moments of joy. The day I left Toronto was a sunny one. Jack came to see me off. "Live well, Rocky," he said, pulling me into a reluctant hug. I gave him a big, warm hug in return. "Jack, it's time for you to move on too," I whispered. Jack smiled faintly, gazing at the planes cutting through the blue sky. "It's tough," he sighed. "Some people, one glance, and it's a lifetime." Then, lowering his head to wipe his eyes, he slowly and deliberately said, "I've tried not to think about her, even thought about dating someone else. But Rocky, meeting someone like Hailey again, it's just too hard." I understood what he meant. Someone like Hailey, once loved, it was forever. He just didn't want to settle, knowing it would hurt others too. Later, I moved to a small town and became an elementary school teacher. Sometimes, looking up at the starry sky, I would wonder, will I ever meet someone I love again? When Serena came looking for me, it was raining lightly. I brought her to a cafe. "Long time no see, Rocky," she said softly, her smile laced with unease. I looked at her and sighed. "Serena, I'm sorry." I apologized earnestly. After a pause, I added, "Please don't come again." Her smile froze. After a moment, she lowered her head. "Not even a little chance?" she asked persistently. How could I explain it to her? Should I mention the memories of being her punching bag or her desperate lifeline? Serena's love for me wasn't much. She simply craved my indulgence, compromise, and the unwavering persistence she couldn't chase away. She wanted someone who wouldn't leave. But loving someone means feeling heartache for them. Like my sister, who always worried whether she was giving me enough, who feared I might feel looked down upon by classmates, and who constantly asked if I'd been wronged. Having been cherished so deeply, I knew what true love looked like. "Serena, you'll meet someone you truly love," I said with a gentle smile. "When that happens, you'll know whether you ever really loved me." I stood to leave, pausing as I passed her. Turning back, I gently advised, "Serena, before that day comes, learn to become a better person. At least, when you meet him, you won't feel like you're not good enough." I walked out the door, and the moment I stepped outside, I saw sunlight breaking through the clouds, illuminating the damp street corners. The gloom was fading. The wind passed by without leaving a trace. Each breeze was an embrace, carrying echoes of a loved one. The end. If you like Kitten's story, please follow and like it. Updated every morning at 9 a.m.